my anchor when the chain broke, just half an hour before sunset, in a bay in the north of Dominica, a foreign country that I'd not checked into, with no mooring buoys, no marina and no land-based spot to pull into with my draft of 1.5 metres. I stood behind the wheel, pressing the anchor drop button, watching the chain pay out and the plastic ties heading for the bow roller and counting off the metres. I mean, one of the big differences of the Caribbean, south of the Virgin Islands, is that everybody anchors most of the time. In many places, marinas and mooring buoys simply don't exist, and this was one of those places. My homegrown technique when I'm single-handing is from behind the wheel to drop the hook to the seabed, then add a few metres on top of it. Then, if there's no wind, give a little burst astern and lay out some more. Then I move forward to the handheld winch control and lay out the correct ratio of chain to depth. Check the tension on the chain to see if the pick is dug in by going astern. But this time, as I stood behind the wheel, I saw, to my horror, a plastic tie go through, then the end of the chain. I took my finger off the button and stared at the empty bow roller. One of those classics, I don't believe this is really happening moments. The next possible stopping place with mooring buoys and a marina was Guadeloupe, some 40 miles north. An overnighter, and I was already pretty tired. A shit hits the fan moment, and it was my fault. Hard to admit, but I'd made a really bad decision, and the consequences of that decision had come home to roost. When I purchased Golden Haze, my Beneteau 323, some 4 years ago, she came with a pretty small, cheap, nasty Danforth type anchor on the bows and 30 metres of chain and 50 metres of pretty thin looking warp. Now, to be fair, I suspect none of the previous owners had anchored very often, as the English Channel isn't blessed with many shallow water anchorages, partly because of the large tidal range and the pretty exposed coastline. When I was getting Golden Haze from Lymington to my home port of Boulogne-sur-Mer, I made a video about it called Sailing in the Pandemic on this YouTube channel. I was very aware that Golden Haze, according to the inventory and the printed label on the anchor locker, had only 30 metres of 8mm chain and 25 metres of pretty light warp attached to this smallish Danforth type anchor. I mean, okay for a well-sheltered overnight in a shallow bay, but not sufficient if push came to shove. Now, there will be many of you who disagree with me, but having completed a 4-year circumnavigation, where I did not spend a single night in a marina, except for Gaul in Sri Lanka, I anchored my boat every day on an excellent CQR, and once I upgraded in New Zealand to 10mm chain and an electric windlass, I never ever dragged. Now, although there are lots of hate stories about CQRs, it's interesting to note that out here in the Caribbean, a very high proportion of boats, particularly French ones, in a place where dropping the anchor is a daily norm whilst cruising, have got a CQR hanging off their bow roller. To be more specific, I've owned and used a Bruce, a Danforth, a Fortress Lightweight and a Fisherman's, as well as several different size CQRs. And the CQR with the appropriate chain has always performed better for me. Now, to be fair, the Fortress was a very useful kedge anchor that I used frequently, and the Admiralty anchor with a tripping line was very good on rocky bottoms. So, when I got back to Boulogne, the first thing I did was to order a new CQR and a further 30 metres of 8mm chain. I quickly discovered that 30 metres of 8mm was overkill and far too much to stow into the anchor locker. The chain simply didn't have enough drop to fall and it wouldn't self-stow. So I reduced the chain length until it would stow in addition to the existing 30 metres of chain. Then I unhooked the old Danforth, laid the new CQR out on the pontoon, attached it with a galvanised shackle to the new chain, and I used a chain link connector purchased from the local chandlers. Big mistake. I now realise that there are dozens of chain connectors manufactured by different companies and with different prices and presumably different qualities of steel. They come as two overlapping loops, and you fit the loops between the two halves and you hammer the pins flat at either end. The theory being that the 3/4 loops bear all the strain, and hammering the flat pins simply keep the two halves together. Now, I have extended the length of my anchor chain before using this sort of chain connector, which of course runs easily over the cogs of your anchor windows because it presents as a normal 8mm chain. I extended the anchor chain in Bambola when I was in the Greek islands. Chain is very inexpensive there for some reason. And from there to the Caribbean, to the Chesapeake, and all the way across the South Pacific, I anchored daily with this chain connector, and it never created an issue. So I felt pretty confident about my actions in Boulogne. Clearly, as the boating market has expanded, various manufacturers have jumped on the bandwagon and started manufacturing these galvanized chain connectors using metal that is not really suitable for the job. Judging from the price range for similar items, which is 3 to 15 euros on the internet, the manufacturing costs must relate to the quality of iron, steel, whatever, that's being used, and the galvanizing process. Sadly, there's nothing left of the missing joining link, so I can't tell you who manufactured it. But after my experience, I think the message is, don't join anchor chain. It could cost you your boat. Buy a new chain to the length that you want, together with a warp already spliced onto it. I really wish I'd not been such a cheapskate and had done just that. Anyway, back to the story. The sun was setting. The overnight sail to Guadeloupe was unattractive, and as I stood looking at the bows, looking down into 6 meters of water below the bows of Golden Haze, I remembered I'd kept the original, somewhat despised Danforth as a spare. It was under the floor of the vast cockpit locker. I remember wondering if it was worth hanging on to it at the time and thinking, what if? Thank goodness I did. The cockpit locker in a Beneteau 323 is vast, and I keep both the inflatable dinghy and the life raft in there. Both these items are tucked away, and if I ever had any doubt about my being able to access the life raft, those doubts were dissipated during the next 10 minutes. First I went below and I grabbed my folding knockoff Leatherman. I found the essential bunch of assorted stainless steel shackles. From experience, I knew the hatch would be inaccessible once the contents of the locker were in the cockpit floor. The locker was, of course, full to the brim with fenders, warps, spare gas bottles, and as the boat drifted gently in Prince Rupert Bay, I pulled the lot out till I got to the floorboards of the locker. I struggled in the setting sun to pull the floorboards up, and then reached into the space below to encounter a couple of small spare fenders. My heart sank. My memory was playing tricks. Bent over, totally upside down in the locker, I reached into the space towards the stern and found the rough shank of the everything is forgiven, wonderful Danforth anchor. I decided not to try to relocate on the bow roller, rather keep it just astern of the pulpit and lead the remaining anchor chain up through the windlass drop hole, over the bow roller, then outside the boat, past the pulpit and back onto the deck. I selected the biggest stainless steel shackle that would join the shank of the anchor and the 8mm chain and tightened up the pin with the knockoff Leatherman. Then I carefully let out a couple of meters of chain, lifted the anchor under the guardrail and dropped it into the noggin. Then I wound in on the electric chain till it was hanging just below the bow roller, and I headed back to the helm, clambering over the contents of the locker, which were all over the cockpit floor. Naturally, during this pretty intensive activity, I'd been keeping an eye out as we were drifting, but only in terms of just not bumping into other anchored craft or the shore. My chart plotter was showing the track where I'd first started to anchor, so I put the anchor back on and steered back to my original anchoring spot. Anchoring behind these Caribbean islands in bays is all pretty similar. Basically, there's a pretty deep water area in the middle of the bay, but as you close the land, it shelves off pretty quickly from 60 or 70 metres to 10 or 15 metres, and then 6 or 7 metres, which is my preferred anchoring depth. When the depth anchor gauge showed 6 metres, I pressed the button and I dropped the Danforth, watching the cable ties pass over the bow roller, waiting for the 10-metre mark so I could go astern and lay the anchor. And of course, then I remembered that the anchor chain markers were now no longer had any significance. And I couldn't for the life of me remember how much new chain I had added before the link. I didn't remember if it was 10 metres or 20 metres or whatever. So I let a couple of 10-metre marks go through, then I moved up to the bows and let the chain out until I could see the rope join in the locker. Then I went back to the stern and backed up to check the holding. One of the single-handing problems when anchoring is you just can't be in two places at once. And because of her Kiwi prop, just a tick over, going astern, quite a lot of power is dragging on the anchor. I watched the GPS speed indicator and eventually decided it was probably holding. Frankly, I was too knackered to bother about anchoring again, and with that much chain out, no wind or significant current around, I decided to call it a night. I went back to the cockpit, replaced the floorboards and stuffed everything back in. Set the anchor alarm, put on the anchor light, and in the darkness of the Caribbean night I went to bed. I couldn't even be bothered to cook. Next morning, the plotter showed we'd dragged a bit, but were basically in the same position. Not surprising with 30 plus metres of chain in 2 or 3 metres of depth. A friend of mine called Jason, in a 25-foot Rhodesian boat which had built himself and single-handed from the Med to the Caribbean last year, said to me, "I suppose you spent the morning diving for the anchor." I nearly choked on my carried beer. Long gone are the days of snorkeling down to the anchor and checking that it's dug in. These days, I just accept I can't do many of the things that were an everyday part of sailing, like fixing things up myself or diving down to anchors, so nowadays I just throw money at the problem.
Okay, this is leaving Rodney Bay, St. Lucia. No, Rodney Bay, St. Lucia. Prince Rupert Bay Dominica. ETA of 3 o'clock. Guadeloupe. I'm making just 5 knots, which is fine. So, not unsurprisingly, I slept like a log last night, although I did wake up and I thought I heard somebody coming on board. So I had a quick shout, then I looked around a few minutes later, so I don't know, maybe it was just the anchor, which I didn't put a snubber on because I wanted to be able to hear in the boat if there was anything going on much down there. Looking at the little diagram displayed on the chart, zoomed right in, I basically hung around the same spot all night, so it's okay. So at least, well, I have an anchor. I have an anchor. I have a destination, Guadeloupe. We'll see what more adventures today is going to bring.
I set sail for the marina at Bastufort in Guadeloupe, sailing past the lovely little group of islands called the Saints to port and the romantically named island of Marie Galante, great name, to starboard. I pulled into the marina, went out to dinner in a nice little restaurant called The Pirate, had a great meal, a few glasses of wine and chilled. There are half a dozen of chandlers within walking distance of the marina in Pointe-à-Pitre, all with different opening hours. So at 0900 I was the first one, which had a very limited supply of anchors. So I then headed for U-Ship in the boatyard. I inquired about CQRs, but they had none in stock. Neither did they have ronkers, and if they did, it would have cost me €800. At half that price was a Delta anchor made by Lumar, and I went for that. It certainly looked the business, and with the aid of a trolley from the capitainery, I took it to the boat and shackled it on. I unpacked the locker again, returned the Danforth to its place under the floor locker, just in case for next time. A few days and a couple of adventures later, I set sail for Dominica and deployed the new Delta for the first time. Having laid out the correct length of scope, I went astern and the pick dug in. I slept with one ear open for the anchor alarm nonetheless. The next morning, the anchor came up, the Delta came up with a load of mud and sand on it, so I deployed the boat hook to knock it off. The next two anchorages on the way back to Martinique also went well, so I think I'm going to stay with it. The Delta deploys and recovers more easily than the CQR due to having a shorter shank. In Le Marin, I got all the chain out and remarked it with white cable ties. I think the lesson is this: never ever use a joining link in your campus chain, in your anchor chain. Certainly, this could have been very serious if the joiner had broken during the night whilst I was asleep in a bit of a blow. I could possibly have lost my boat. I'm still concerned that the existing 30 metres of chain is not really enough. I think I need another 20, although the self-stowing issues will come back. So I'll have a think about it and look in the piggy bank and see if I can totally renew the chain with a better length than 30 metres and some really strong warp already spliced on the end. There are a few more expensive issues on that voyage to Guadeloupe and then back to Martinique, which I'll talk about later in the next video. But this anchor story just shows how fallible the stuff is that we buy when it's supposed to be made for the job and actually wasn't. I'm back in Europe now, as you can see. Golden Haze is stripped down, sitting in the marina in her berth in Le Marin, doubled up with mooring lines and fingers crossed for the next hurricane season. Beryl has just hit the islands further south, although the Guardian camera I've got set up in the boat shows that in fact we just bounced around a little bit with a bit of a swell in Martinique, so I think she's all okay. I am, of course, very concerned about the hurricanes that are following up, and there's another 3 months of the season to go, so fingers crossed. Anyway, I'm looking forward to reading your anchor comments. It's a subject I normally avoid because, like politics and sex, everybody has an opinion about it. Anyway, that was my anchoring story. Bye. My library of digital sailing books is at gentlesailing.com, so you can buy them as instant downloads. There's a link to a printer who can convert them to hard copy if that's what you prefer. I've just totally updated and republished French Canal Routes to the Mediterranean, which is now in its 12th edition and is fully up to date with new information, charts and pictures. Recently I published Your Boat in the Sun, which proved an instant popular success. It's about where to keep your boat in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean and the costs and the logistics involved. The Atlantic Crossing Guide has become a bestseller and it outsells most of the others, probably because it's arguably one of the most comprehensive guides to sailing to the Caribbean that's available. The Gentle Sailing Route to the Mediterranean is one of the most popular publications that I have. It describes how to coast hop all the way to Gibraltar without having to spend a night at sea. There are books about marinas in the Med, sailing in the Caribbean islands, as well as a book on simple navigation, and even a Pacific Ocean crossing guide, and a book about just living aboard a sailing boat. Anyway, it's all at gentlesailing.com, so please do pay the site a visit and browse through my publications if you have a moment. Thanks. Fair winds.